The rain was relentless that afternoon in Manhattan, falling in silver sheets against the windows of Wexler International Holdings, a corporate giant known for its wealth, power, and intimidating glass tower. Inside its grand marble lobby, a young delivery man stood quietly with a soaked package in hand. His name was Marco, and everything about him screamed invisible. His shoes were cheap and worn, his jacket too thin for the storm outside, and his presence barely registered with the receptionist, who pointed without even lifting her eyes. "Leave it at the desk," she muttered. Marco nodded, placing the brown parcel gently down, careful not to drip water on the polished surface. Just as he turned to leave, a door down the hall swung open violently, and a voice thundered across the marble. "Where is the translator? We have a call in 5 minutes with our Dubai partners, and nobody speaks Arabic?" It was Anthony Wexler, the infamous billionaire CEO. Tall, commanding, impeccably dressed, known for closing deals worth hundreds of millions with a single phone call. He looked agitated, his team scrambling behind him. Marco paused mid-step. His heart pounded. He shouldn't say anything. He was just a courier. But then he turned back. "I can help with that," Marco said calmly. Anthony turned, his piercing gaze falling on the delivery guy. "Excuse me," Marco repeated, louder this time. "I speak Arabic. I studied it for 6 years." The room fell completely silent. One of the assistants whispered, "He's the delivery guy." Another snorted, "He's bluffing." But Marco didn't flinch. "Try me," he said confidently. Anthony crossed his arms, skeptical but curious. "Say this: we apologize for the delay in the report, and we will have it delivered by the end of the day." Marco did, in fluent Arabic, perfectly articulated and effortlessly delivered. Everyone blinked. "How many languages do you speak?" Anthony asked slowly, still processing. 7, Marco replied. In a blink, the dynamic shifted. The assistant who dismissed him was now fumbling with a notepad. Another rushed to connect the call. "And Anthony?" He waved Marco forward like an honored guest, pointing to the elevator. "You're coming upstairs." Marco followed, his wet shoes squeaking slightly as he entered a world few delivery drivers ever saw: executive suites, glass offices, expensive art lining the walls. The higher they went, the heavier the silence became. Marco felt every eye on him, dressed in thrift store clothes, among people who wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent. But his posture was calm, steady, like a man used to carrying more than just boxes. When they reached the boardroom, Anthony turned to him. "Before this call, tell me, who are you really?" Marco's answer was quiet, but firm. Just someone who couldn't afford to stay where he belonged. Anthony stared at him, puzzled. Marco looked around the room filled with wealth and added, "Languages were my passport to a better life, but life had other plans." There was something in his eyes, something honest, and yet something hidden. The assistant returned, whispering in Anthony's ear, "The call's ready." Anthony nodded and motioned for Marco to sit beside him. "Translate. Let's see what you can really do." And in that moment, as the screens lit up and foreign executives appeared, Marco took a deep breath, sat up straight, and with the grace of someone who had once been destined for greatness, began to speak. Not as a courier, but as a man who understood the power of words and the value of being underestimated. No one in that room realized they were witnessing the first step of a transformation. But something told Anthony this wasn't going to be just another business call. Marco's voice filled the room with calm authority. The video call with the Dubai investors had begun tense. Sharp questions, frustrated interruptions, and cultural misunderstandings thick in the air. But once Marco started translating, the tone shifted. Not only did he bridge the language gap, but he also understood nuance. He didn't just translate words, he carried meaning. He softened demands, reinforced respect, and even inserted subtle humor where needed. The clients, visibly relieved, smiled for the first time in the meeting. Anthony watched him carefully. Every minute that passed chipped away at the disbelief. Marco wasn't just fluent, he was trained, polished, professional. He didn't belong delivering boxes. That much was clear. When the call ended 45 minutes later with a verbal commitment from the Dubai team to sign a multi-million-dollar expansion agreement, the boardroom erupted in quiet applause. Anthony didn't join in. He was still staring at Marco. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, voice low and tense. Marco hesitated, then said, I studied linguistics at the University of Geneva. Full scholarship. I wanted to work in diplomacy, maybe the UN, but life changed. He left it there, not offering more. And Anthony, despite his billionaire instinct to probe, didn't push. Yet. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a pen against his lip. You just saved a deal that's been weeks in the making. Why are you delivering packages for $15 an hour? Marco's jaw tightened slightly. My mother had a stroke. I had to come home. No time for internships. No time for dreams. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I needed money, not titles. The silence was heavy after that. Then Anthony stood. I want you here tomorrow, 9 a.m., my floor. Marco blinked. Doing what? Anthony shrugged. We'll figure it out. I don't waste talent. Marco left that day, still drenched from the storm, but lighter somehow. As the elevator carried him back down from the floors of fortune to the lobby of the Overlooked, he clutched a new business card in his hand. Clean, sharp, with the Wexler Holdings logo printed in silver. It felt like a ticket to another life. One he wasn't sure he deserved anymore. But outside, as he climbed onto the subway and took his usual seat beside strangers and neon ads for payday loans, Marco's phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't know. It read, You impressed the boss, but not everyone's thrilled. Watch your step. A friend. His stomach dropped. The next morning, Marco returned to Wexler HQ dressed in his best attempt at business attire. A white shirt, navy slacks, both slightly wrinkled from years in the back of a closet. He entered the executive floor with a security badge around his neck, earning side glances and hushed murmurs from assistants who had never seen a delivery guy ride the private elevator. Anthony greeted him with a nod. Here early. Good. He handed Marco a folder. You'll sit in on translation for our European division this week. Shadow our business strategist. Learn. Observe. Marco opened the folder. Contracts in 5 languages. International legal terms. High-level strategy notes. He took a breath. You trust me with this? Anthony didn't smile. I trust outcomes. You gave me one yesterday. But as Marco was led to his new workspace, passing glass-walled offices and whispering staff, one particular woman watched him with narrowed eyes. Her name was Celeste Monroe, Director of International Development. Sharp, calculating, and Anthony's most trusted advisor. She had built her career on being the smartest person in the room. And right now she didn't like what she saw. Because Marco, with no title, no wealth, no suit, was quickly becoming the most talked about man in the company. And she had a feeling he was hiding more than just his past. Before we dive deeper into this journey, if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul, hit the like button, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. We love hearing your stories too. In the days that followed, Marco settled into a strange new rhythm, translating high-stakes documents by day, riding the subway home by night. He sat in on meetings with global partners, clarified contracts that had once cost the company thousands in delays, and seamlessly switched between French, German, Mandarin, and more. Executives began to nod in approval when he entered the room. Even the notoriously cold CFO once said, I've never seen Anthony move this fast on someone. The kid's good. But still, questions lingered. Who was Marco really? How had someone so clearly brilliant fallen off the radar of every major firm, government agency, and Ivy League recruiter? No one knew, and Marco wasn't offering answers. Except for Anthony, he didn't push. He watched, observed. He could see something in Marco, something he'd only seen in a few men before. The kind of drive that came not from ambition, but from necessity, a quiet desperation that turned into precision, the kind of desperation money couldn't teach, but that often produced miracles. One morning, Anthony invited Marco into his private office, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River. Sit, he said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. Marco sat, his posture straight but unassuming. Anthony leaned forward. Tell me one thing, he said, his tone serious. If I gave you access to my contacts, my network, even my money, what would you do with it? Marco didn't hesitate. I'd disappear. Anthony raised an eyebrow. That's not what most people say. I'm not most people, Marco replied. The room fell into a long silence. Finally, Anthony nodded slowly. All right, I can work with that. But as Marco stepped out, Celeste appeared in the hallway like a shadow. You've made quite the impression, she said, her smile tight. Anthony doesn't usually bring people in off the street. Marco nodded politely. I'm just doing what I can. She stepped closer. Don't get too comfortable. This place has a way of chewing people up. Her voice dropped to a whisper, especially ones with secrets. That night, Marco returned to his modest apartment in Queens and sat by the window, watching traffic lights flicker through the rain. He pulled out an old, tattered notebook and flipped through pages filled with language notes, memories, and a photo tucked between the sheets. A woman smiling in a hospital bed. His mother. Her eyes had once been bright. Now they were tired and distant. The stroke had taken her speech, her movement, everything. He worked to pay for her care. That was the truth. But there was more. Something he hadn't told anyone, not even Anthony. He had once been offered a lucrative contract by a global security firm, not just for translation, but for surveillance, negotiation, and espionage. His ability to adapt, to read people, to slip between cultures had drawn attention. Dangerous attention. And when he refused their final offer, things turned dark. A close friend disappeared. His academic records were tampered with. The scholarship vanished. His mother was found unconscious a week later. It wasn't coincidence. So Marco ran. Now, as he looked at the Wexler card in his hand, he wondered, had he stayed hidden too long? Was this a second chance or a trap? Back at Wexler Holdings, Celeste stood in the executive lounge, watching Marco's file load on her encrypted laptop. She had pulled strings to dig deeper. But there was a problem. His record was too clean. Suspiciously so. No student loan debt. No tax history. No passport stamps. It was like he had appeared out of nowhere. And Celeste didn't believe in ghosts. Something was off, and she intended to find out exactly what it was before Marco got any closer to the man who signed her checks. The following Monday, Marco arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was still quiet, the kind of stillness that belongs only to the very rich and the very disciplined. He didn't head to his desk. Instead, he went straight to the 51st floor, Anthony Wexler's private domain. Anthony had asked him to review sensitive communications from a new client in Geneva. But Marco knew it wasn't just about the documents. It was another test. Every time Anthony looked at him lately, it felt like a silent challenge. How far can I trust you? Anthony was already there, sipping espresso from a porcelain cup, gazing out at the city skyline like a man considering his next billion. He didn't turn when Marco entered. The documents are on the table, he said. Read them. Tell me what's not being said. Marco sat down, fingers gliding across the printed text. The contract was written in diplomatic French, polished and direct, and laced with hidden intentions. It wasn't just a business deal. It was a political maneuver. They're trying to get Wexler Holdings to commit capital through a proxy. If it backfires, they'll deny involvement, and you'll take the fall, Marco said. Anthony turned around slowly. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, not surprise, but confirmation. And what would you do if you were me? I'd walk away, but quietly. No press, no public exit. Just disappear from a table. Anthony smiled, this time genuinely. You're dangerous, Marco, in the best way. But someone else had been listening. Later that day, Marco found a white envelope on his desk. No name, no return address. Inside, a single typed sentence. You're not the only one who knows how to disappear. His hands froze. He looked around the office. Everyone looked normal, typing, walking, talking. But he knew someone was watching him closely. His mind went to Celeste. She hadn't said anything since their last interaction, but her silence felt like a blade resting gently on his neck. Still, Marco didn't flinch. Instead, he focused on the Geneva deal and rewrote the terms in a way that subtly reversed the leverage, turning the power dynamic in Anthony's favor. When he handed the revised version to Anthony that evening, the CEO read it silently, then whistled. This is brilliant. You just saved us millions. Marco smiled. Just doing my job. But behind the smile was a whirlwind of calculation. He knew he was now in the center of something much bigger, not just business. This was about power, control, and reputation. In a world built on money, status, and ruthless ambition, people like Anthony didn't let others rise unless they saw a return. And people like Celeste didn't let threats linger. That night, Anthony invited Marco to a private dinner at his penthouse, a place only a handful of people had ever seen. The moment Marco stepped in, he was struck by the understated luxury. Walls lined with art, glass shelves holding ancient artifacts, and a piano in the corner Anthony never played. "You're wondering why I brought you here," Anthony said as he poured 2 glasses of red wine. Marco nodded. "I think you could be more than just an employee. I think you could be a partner." Marco's hand paused midair. "Partner? I've had people with credentials, people with pedigrees, Ivy League suits who crumble under pressure. You see things before they happen. That's rare. That's valuable." Marco stayed silent, then asked carefully, "And what did that kind of partnership cost?" Anthony smirked. "Loyalty." Marco looked him in the eyes. "Then you should know. I don't lie, but I don't tell everything either." Anthony nodded slowly. "Fair enough." But unknown to both of them, Celeste had placed a small recording device in the room earlier that week, part of a larger plan. And what she heard in that conversation confirmed her deepest suspicion. Marco wasn't here to rise. He was here to reclaim something, and she was going to make sure he never got it. Celeste sat alone in her office that night, the city glowing beneath her window. In her hand, a flash drive containing the audio from Anthony's penthouse. She replayed it for the 5th time. Marco's voice was steady, controlled, too controlled. "I don't lie, but I don't tell everything either." The way he said it, it wasn't arrogance. It was intention. She leaned back in her chair, connecting dots that others hadn't noticed. His arrival, his timing, the way Anthony, so calculated with trust, had taken to Marco like a long-lost protege. Celeste wasn't just protective of the company. She was protective of her position, her influence, her closeness to Wexler's fortune. And now Marco threatened all of that. Meanwhile, Marco was back at his apartment, hunched over his notebook again. This time it wasn't just memories. It was strategy, names, patterns, connections. For weeks, he'd been collecting information quietly, listening, reading, memorizing internal structures, understanding how Wexler Holdings truly operated. And he had uncovered something alarming. Several shell companies, listed under subsidiaries in Luxembourg, had been funneling millions of dollars through vague consulting services. And Celeste's name appeared on nearly every authorization form. Marco didn't know exactly what she was hiding yet, but he knew one thing: it wasn't clean. And in a company built on reputation, legacy, and elite partnerships, even a whisper of scandal could collapse everything. Still, he didn't act. Not yet. He needed one more piece of proof. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Anthony asked Marco to accompany him to Zurich for a private negotiation with a luxury tech conglomerate. "It's not official," he said. "They don't want lawyers in the room. Just trust and language." Marco accepted, but before leaving, he sent a package, anonymously, to a local journalist in New York. Inside was a copy of the Luxembourg documents, with one note: follow the money. In Zurich, things moved fast. The meeting was discreet, held in a villa outside the city. The partners spoke German and French interchangeably, but Marco danced between languages like a symphony conductor, clarifying terms, smoothing edges, and charming the room. Anthony watched with silent admiration. "You were born for this," he whispered, as they stepped out for air. Marco smiled, but inside a storm raged, because while he was translating business, the real negotiation was still to come. That night, Marco sat across from Anthony at the villa's dining table. Wine poured. Laughter eased the tension. And then Anthony leaned in. "You remind me of me when I was younger," he said. "Hungry, clever, ruthless if needed." Marco tilted his head. "Do you regret it?" Anthony looked out the window, lost in the lights. "Only the people I lost along the way." There was a long pause. Then Marco asked, "What would you do if someone in your company was stealing from you?" Anthony's face turned. "Who?" "I'm not ready to say, but I will be." Anthony stared at him, eyes suddenly sharp. "If you're wrong, this could burn everything." "And if I'm right?" Marco replied, "You won't just save your money, you'll save your name." Back in New York, Celeste got the call she had feared. "There's a journalist poking around the Luxembourg books," her contact said. "They mentioned your name." Her heart sank. She knew immediately. Marco. Somehow, he had turned the spotlight on her. But she still had one weapon left. Something Marco didn't know. The following morning, when Anthony returned from Zurich, Celeste was waiting. She held a small envelope in her hand and placed it on his desk without a word. Inside were grainy photos of Marco outside a foreign embassy, talking to men known for intelligence work years ago. "He's not who you think he is," she said quietly. "He's not here to help you. He's here to bury you." Anthony looked at the photos. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since meeting Marco, he began to question everything. Anthony didn't say a word for hours after seeing the photos. He just stared at them. Marco outside a secure embassy, talking to men whose faces had been blurred in official records. There was no timestamp, no context, just enough mystery to make trust feel dangerous. When Marco walked into his office that morning, the tension in the air was different, colder. He noticed it instantly. Anthony's usual warm confidence had been replaced by distance. "Close the door," the CEO said. Marco obeyed. Anthony slid the envelope across the table. "Explain." Marco looked down, calmly lifting the photos from the paper. He didn't flinch. "These are real," he said, "but they're not what you think." "I want the truth," Anthony snapped. Now, Marco leaned back in the chair. 3 years ago, I was approached by an international agency. They wanted me to use my skills for covert diplomatic work. I considered it, but I said no. I wasn't interested in that life. Not in lies, not in power plays. I didn't want to disappear behind politics. He paused. They didn't take the rejection well. I was erased from academic databases. Opportunities vanished. My scholarship dissolved overnight. And then my mother had her stroke. He let those last words settle. I was punished for choosing peace. So I ran, hid, took the first job that would pay. Anthony's expression didn't change. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because this world isn't kind to people with complicated stories. And because I didn't trust you yet." Anthony folded his hands slowly. "And now, I think you're a man who built an empire out of instinct. I think you know when someone's lying to you. So ask yourself, do I look like a liar?" Anthony didn't answer. Meanwhile, across town, the journalist who had received Marco's anonymous tip was preparing to publish. The story wasn't just about offshore accounts or shell companies. It connected Wexler Holdings to a much larger chain of shadow deals, falsified earnings reports, strategic bribes, and international laundering. And in the middle of it all was Celeste Monroe's signature. But Celeste was already preparing her defense. She had called a closed-door emergency board meeting. With Anthony still uncertain about Marco, she moved swiftly. "We have a problem," she began, handing out printed articles and blurred photos. "An internal breach. Someone with a hidden past has accessed sensitive financial records, leaked company data, and is working with the press." All eyes turned to her. She continued, "Marco De Luca is a threat to this company, to everything Anthony has built. I believe he's here under false pretenses, and I have reason to believe he's been manipulating data and employees to rise quickly." Gasps filled the room. She then played a short, carefully edited audio clip. Marco's voice could be heard. "I'm not here to rise. I'm here to reclaim something." Taken out of context, the phrase sounded dangerous, vengeful. Back at headquarters, Anthony finally confronted Marco once more. "Celeste brought this to the board," he said. "They're calling for your termination." Marco didn't blink. "Of course they are. Did you leak the files?" "Yes." Anthony's eyes narrowed. "You admit it?" "I do. Because it wasn't betrayal. It was accountability." Anthony stood, his voice rising. "You humiliated this company." Marco stepped forward, fierce now. "No, I saved it. You just don't see it yet." He placed a USB drive on the desk. "Everything Celeste's done, the companies, the transfers, the signatures, it's all here. I didn't destroy you. I exposed what was rotting inside your empire." Anthony picked up the drive, his hands trembling slightly. Outside the office, whispers had started to spread. The press was circling. Investors were calling. And inside those walls of marble and glass, A billionaire had to make a choice: protect his image or face the truth head-on. Anthony stood at the edge of his office, staring out at the city that had made him rich. The USB drive Marco had left sat on his desk like a loaded weapon, quiet, cold, and explosive. In just a few hours, the company's world had unraveled. The press had broken the story. Anonymous sources confirmed that multiple offshore entities tied to Wexler Holdings were involved in a wide network of financial manipulation. Stock prices were trembling, and inside the building, board members scrambled for cover. Celeste was nowhere to be found. Her office had been emptied overnight. Her phone disconnected. She had vanished. Marco waited alone in the lobby, calm amidst the chaos. People passed him without a glance, the same way they had when he was just a delivery guy. Before they realized the power he carried wasn't in a title, a watch, or a suit, but in something no one could steal: his integrity. Finally, Anthony appeared. He walked toward Marco slowly, his expression unreadable. Behind him, assistants were fielding urgent calls, attorneys were drafting statements, and damage control teams were already working to preserve what was left of the brand. But Anthony wasn't thinking about optics anymore. Not right now. He stood in front of Marco, took a breath, and said, "You were right." Marco nodded. "I wasn't looking to hurt you, just to stop the bleeding before it got fatal." Anthony held his gaze for a long moment, then extended his hand. "I want you to stay." But Marco hesitated. "To do what?" "To rebuild it with me, from the inside, without secrets, without greed." His voice softened. "I spent years thinking money was the only shield I needed. But you reminded me that character is louder than cash. And now, I need that kind of voice at my side." Marco looked around. The glass, the cold steel, the towering image of wealth. "I never wanted to climb this tower," he said, "but I do want to help fix it." He shook Anthony's hand. A week later, Wexler Holdings released a public statement acknowledging the internal corruption scandal and vowing a complete overhaul. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the apology. It was the announcement that followed. Anthony Wexler, billionaire CEO, had quietly liquidated one of his largest personal assets, a $25 million, yet that once symbolized his opulence. The funds were used not to launch charity, not to build a school in his name, but to start a fully funded global language and diplomacy program designed for underprivileged youth from conflict zones and struggling communities. The goal: to train interpreters, negotiators, and peace builders like Marco. Because, in Anthony's words, language can save more lives than lawyers ever could. The press praised it. Investors were surprised. But Marco? He smiled quietly, standing at the back of the first class, held in a modest building in Brooklyn, far from skyscrapers and billion-dollar conference rooms. Around him were young students, some refugees, others born into poverty, learning their first words in Arabic, Mandarin, or French. Marco now worked as their mentor, not just a translator, but a guide. And he knew he had done something no amount of money could ever replicate. He had turned pain into purpose. And as the sun set outside that small classroom, Marco looked at a chalkboard full of foreign letters and said softly, "This is the real fortune." Because in a world obsessed with riches, power, and reputation, sometimes the greatest wealth is simply being able to give someone their voice back. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to our channel, share this video, and tell us in the comments, what part of this journey moved you the most? There's another story waiting for you, and it might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.